everybody, and welcome to what is probably my 45th different place in this living room trying to do a video. Let's spice things up a bit. This video is about Lightroom, and specifically how to deal with Lightroom if you're a beginner. So I get emails, probably 1 or 2 a week, from people who are just starting with Lightroom, and it's not helping them produce the photos that they want to produce. And typically in that situation, what they do is look for 2 things. They either email a photographer, or they'll go on YouTube and look for answers, or they'll buy someone's presets. And I've done a whole video about what I think about buying people's presets. I'll link it below. I'm not going to talk too much about that. But basically, they're just looking for help. And if I have time, I'll go back to them and I won't ask to see their photos. I'll ask to see their Lightroom settings. And typically, it's quite easy to very quickly understand where they're going wrong. And there are loads of places you can go wrong with photo editing, but there are a couple of main ones I see. The first one is just down to inexperience, but the second is down to bad advice from other YouTube tutorials, from people who don't really know what they're doing and they're just following trends and they think they're making cool changes to photos when really they're not. So, let's delve into an example. Okay, so here is an image that I took in New Zealand a while back, and I posted this on my Instagram the other day. Basically, somebody asked me if the North Island of New Zealand was worth visiting, and I sent back this photo. Not this photo exactly, I'd edited it a bit, which again, we'll go through. So what I normally see in terms of settings with any photo is that people will boost the contrast, which with a raw file, no problem with that, 95% of the time, that is the right thing to do. But then what they'll do is they'll decrease the highlights, boost the shadows, increase the clarity, increase the vibrance, increase the saturation, maybe even increase the saturation of some individual colours, boost the sharpening, boost the noise reduction, maybe even have a vignette, add some grain, add some dehazing, and then they'll look at the file and go, why doesn't that look quite right? And that's problem number 1, having a feeling that you need to do something with every single slider and tool. This MacBook Pro does not like screen recording. You hear that? Flipping out. Anyway, problem number 2 just comes from bad advice. So what I typically see is, again, they'll boost the contrast and then they'll go down to the highlights and they'll lower the highlights and increase the shadows, which by default gets rid of some of the contrast. And then they'll go down to the tone curve, and they've heard all about tone curves because every tutorial includes tone curves. And don't get me wrong, it's a hugely powerful tool, particularly when you're dealing with color. But what I see a lot in Lightroom tutorials is that people will just have an S-curve by default, regardless of what their other settings are. So, as we've said, we've already increased contrast, we've then reduced contrast in the highlights and the shadows, then we might add some local contrast in terms of clarity, and then we'll go down to the tone curve and we'll implement some kind of S-curve. So we'll bring down the shadows and up the highlights again. So we've increased the contrast, decreased the contrast, increased the local contrast, and then increased the overall contrast again, which is just a complete mishmash. And if you're dealing with particularly JPEG files, they haven't got enough data to stretch all that far, and the file just starts to look horrible, particularly when you add in the fact that you're boosting all the sliders on all the colors and all the tones and all the options. You're just going way too far with stuff. And those are the 2 most common problems I see. And it's not just Lightroom. Obviously you have the option to edit with sliders on Instagram and stuff as well, but that's the biggest thing for where beginners go wrong when dealing with editing tools, is that they've got all these tools at their disposal and they just want to use them to their full potential all the time. I was no different as a beginner. I don't know anyone who wasn't, but that typically leads to photos that look like they've been taken or edited by a beginner. So how would I tackle this image? Let's reset this and start again. So first of all, I would go down to the lens corrections. This was taken with a lens that needs some correction, so that's the first thing I would do. Next, I would go to contrast, and like I said, with most RAW files, 95% of the time, starting with increasing the contrast is a good place to be. I'm going to leave highlights and shadows for now and work out what else I can do to the image first. The first thing I want to tackle really is clarity. I'm going to add a bit of clarity, but then also colour. I really want to get down to colour. Now I'm going to leave vibrance and saturation as they are because I want to tackle colours individually. Now whenever you approach a photo, you've got to ask, what do you want people to look at? And in this situation there are a few different options. As you can see, there's a couple down here that I might want to form part of the subject. I like this kind of sweeping road around the bay. I might want that to be the subject. There's this incredible blue water, or aqua I guess you'd call it. And in the background you can see there's these snow-capped mountains, and I could really try and bring those into play if I wanted to. But I think for this, I'm going to stick with 2 subjects. I'm going to stick with the bright water here and this sweeping road around the edge. And to do that, I'm going to use some colour. So, aqua, I'm going to boost the saturation of the aqua water, which should help with that straight away. But I don't want the colour of the sky to detract from that, so I want to get rid of some of the saturation in the blue. I'm also going to go to luminance and up the luminance of the blue just to make sure that that sky definitely isn't going to be a problem. Now I think straight away that looks much better, but the problem is this aqua colour is really deep and rich now, and it isn't quite matched by these colours around the outside of the road. So I'm going to go back to saturation, and I'm going to up the yellows, and I'm going to up the greens too. Problem with that now though is that I find they're too distracting, and the real harsh punch of the aqua has disappeared a bit because of these greens and yellows. So I'm going to go back to luminance, and I'm going to raise the luminance of the yellow, and I'm going to raise the luminance slightly of the green too. And what that does is keeps the brightness, but just gets rid of the really harsh tone of the yellow, and means that this aqua stands out again. In this instance, I'm not going to worry about split toning, and I don't think I'm even going to worry about tone curve because I increased contrast right at the start of the process. I'm definitely not bothered about a vignette. I don't need any grain for a photo like this, and it was a really dry, clear day, so I certainly don't need the dehaze tool. And to be honest, that's pretty much that. Now I could use the brush tool just to boost some clarity, just on the road and on the bit of the water that we want to concentrate on. So I'll just take that brush down a little bit and just move along this road with this brush, upping the clarity, and I might just take a few strokes of that along the water too. But that basically is a very simple, very quick edit and how I would approach a photo. First, if it's not particularly obvious, find what you want your subject to be, and then just don't go too overboard with the colours and the sliders. You don't need to use them all, and when you do use them, try and make sure that the sliders are a bit balanced. If you're moving right to the end on all of them, chances are your image isn't going to look great. But yeah, that's pretty much that. I hope that was useful, and until next time when I might tackle something a little bit more advanced, thanks for watching.